these are writers writing in Greek. So they're educated in Greek. They know some of their Greek classics, right? We have papyrus and potsherds and stuff like that of school exercises where people would be copying out Homer. So people were educated on this. So we should expect to see references here and there or allusions to Greek classics. Mandaean literature. The Mandaeans are a Gnostic group from Iran. They have some connections with Manichaeism. It's interesting in their text that they really elevate John the Baptist even higher than Jesus. They're actually adversaries. And Jesus is accused in the text of being a lying prophet and a magician, and he gets expelled. And so the Mandaeans, they don't trace themselves to Jesus, they trace themselves to John the Baptist. Sometimes people think, well, texts just tell history, they're just telling a story. But no, all texts have a reason, right? Have a purpose. So the Gospel of Judas, we know it existed by around 180 when Irenaeus of Lyon mentions it. We have no trace of it from antiquity until, I think it was around 2004, maybe 2007, something like that, when a copy of it was released to the world. And they saw Judas in the text as a hero, not a villain. These apostles have a dream in which they see some priests and they're doing awful things, sacrificing their children. And Jesus says, well, that's you guys. The apostles are portrayed very, very negatively. And think of that again as a microcosm of groups in the church. So certainly this text is setting itself up against mainstream Christianity of some sort. And Judas is certainly one outside that number because he's a betrayer. So he's kind of set apart as somewhat special. So Jesus now has this discussion with Judas. And at one point he says, see the apostles over there. They are terrible. You will surpass them. But in the end of the text, Judas still betrays him. And Judas is still the villain.
Today, my guest is Professor Tony Burke from Toronto University, who has put together an anthology of ancient non-biblical Christian literature, which presents informed introductions and readable translations from a wide range of little-known apocryphal texts, most of which have never been translated into any modern language until now. My question today is for Christians that might be watching. And the question is this: what makes you think that the books that are in your Bible would be approved by Jesus? And what makes you think the texts that are out there that are not in your Bible would be rejected by Jesus? Today, let's talk about those texts and see what they suggest by the experts. Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And my guest today is Professor Tony Burke, who is putting together these collections of apocryphal texts that links are in the description. You can look at them. There's 3 volumes right now, lots of material, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And I just want to start off by asking you, because the list of the books in your series, New Testament Apocrypha, more non-canonical scriptures, they have an enormous amount of titles that would not be considered household names today. Maybe some Christians know them, but they're not like everyone doesn't know about them. In your estimate, how well known were some of these books in the times when these books were written? And which ones would you say were extremely rare? Which ones are common?
Okay, good questions. Yeah, if you want to get a sense of how many texts there are, the volumes give you some good sense of that, but there's also the nascal.com has what's called the eClavis Christian Apocrypha, which also has lots of online resources for these texts as well. And there's somewhere between 250 and 300 or so Christian apocryphal texts, so quite a lot. And they range in time of composition from maybe the late 1st century till, about 10 years ago. So people keep writing them, right? Certainly the ones that people are most interested in, it seems, are the early ones, because, well, there's a sense that the earlier the texts are, the closer, well, the more likely, more likely it is that they might have some information about Jesus that is historical, because everyone really wants to find out who is the historical Jesus, right?
Right.
So texts like the Gospel of Thomas tend to be front of most people's consciousness. And which is one, as you said, a household name today. The point of this series that I've edited is to make people aware of texts that they may not know very much about. Though some of these texts were very popular in antiquity. You look at, again, the Gospel of Thomas, we only have we have 3 Greek scraps of it and then a longer Coptic text. So the amount of physical evidence we have for that text is dwarfed by the interest in it by people today. Yet we have something like 400 copies of a text called the Gospel of Nicodemus, which people may not know that well today, but was certainly very, very popular in antiquity and throughout the Middle Ages. So what were the big ones in antiquity? The infancy Gospel of James, for example, is stories about Mary and her conception and infancy, and that segues into Jesus. Somewhere around 200 Greek manuscripts of that alone. Very, very popular. The Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, which is an expansion of that text and includes some material from the infancy Gospel of Thomas. Also lots and lots of manuscripts, right?
Are these all 2nd century texts?
The infancy Gospel of James is probably late 2nd century. People tend to date it somewhere around 175 or so. Pseudo-Matthew is more closer to 6th or 7th century.
Oh, wow.
It's an adaptation of that, but it just shows you how it continues to be popular. Gospel of Nicodemus, probably around the 4th century. And some people are aware of these texts today, but they would have been, in some ways, household names in antiquity and the medieval period as well. Not so much because people would know the text by name, but they would know the contents. So, for example, readings from the infancy Gospel of James would be part of the regular cycle of readings for festivals, certain festivals, commemorating events in Mary's life. So they would know those stories, or they would know them in iconography. We're very familiar with the nativity scene that we see in the West today. It's a blending of Luke and Matthew, but in the East, it would also include elements from the infancy Gospel of James. So that would be very much in their consciousness. And one other example, these throughout the medieval period, there were these what we call mystery plays, where people would put on these plays in the marketplaces of towns, and they would run from creation to the Last Judgment, so beginning to the end of time. And some of the material from Apocryphal texts would end up being in those plays, including the Gospel of Nicodemus material. And that the main part of that is of most interest is where Jesus, after he dies, he goes down, he descends into hell and liberates the Hebrew Bible patriarchs, Abraham, Adam, and so on, who never got a chance to meet Jesus, would never be saved because of knowledge of Jesus. So he has to go down there and preach to them, and that way they are able to get out of the underworld and go to heaven. So very much something that people in antiquity and throughout the medieval period would know quite well, despite the fact that they're not in the Bible today.
That's interesting you mentioned that, because in a lot of evangelical Baptist circles, they do believe that Jesus went down there and preached the gospel and got people saved from hell or Hades, whatever you want to call it. But it's not, that particular story isn't found in the 66 canonical books anywhere. So they just it just kind of gets absorbed into this stream of consciousness of Christians without realizing it. That's where it comes from then, right?
There is a vague reference to it in 1st or 2nd Peter. I can't remember which one. And that may be the origin of the idea, but it's, like I said, it's quite vague. But yeah, it gets spun out into Gospel of Nicodemus and several other journey to hell texts or liberation of hell texts. And yeah, it's one of these things that's part of Christian consciousness that people don't really know where it comes from. A great example of that kind of thing is people thinking that the snake in the Garden of Eden is the devil, or
right,
that the fruit is an apple. It's just part of knowledge that people don't realize does not have biblical basis.
Really good point there. Was the church more likely to accept some books other than others? Like the infancy gospel, you mentioned that. Was this book widely accepted by Christians, or was it controversial?
It was widely accepted by Christians in the East, which is where the Greek text proliferated, but also there's lots of copies in Syriac and Ethiopic and Arabic. Less so in the West. The West got their infancy Gospel of James material through the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew. So so it's basically a Latin translation and then an expansion. So yeah, super widely known. So yeah, those seem to be very popular. People want to know more about Jesus, want to know more about Mary, but also very popular are stories of saints. So the apostles, for example. Mary's a saint too, but I'm thinking specifically of apostles. So in the late 2nd century, thereabouts, maybe the early 3rd, there are these individual acts of the apostles that were created. So the canonical book of Acts is all of the apostles, right? But these individual acts are Acts of Thomas, Acts of John, Acts of Peter, etc. So they begin to be composed around the end of the 2nd century. And before long, every apostle has one. Even secondary apostles like Matthias, who joined the group after Judas went off and hung himself. So every apostle gets one of these, and they're very widely copied and adapted in various ways. So the earliest of these people are most interested in because they have some unorthodox kind of contents. It's really when the church is still working out what belief is, what correct belief is versus wrong belief. So these early texts have some really unorthodox contents, but and so they don't all survive intact completely, but they do survive in a sense in their adaptations, translated into Latin with some changes made, translated into other languages and so on. So we have quite a large amount of those texts in various forms. And they get boiled down in the Middle Ages to some bare information that become Lives of Saints collections as well. So they're widely known, Apocryphal Acts. Certain texts that connect with doctrine. So for example, we talked about the infancy Gospel of James, which talks about Mary's birth and conception and upbringing. But we have also a text about her death called the Dormition of Mary. And that's very widely known as well. There's lots of variations of it in lots of languages. But it talks about how when Mary died, there are variations among them. In one, she dies, and then her soul is instantly reunited with her, and she goes up to heaven. So body and soul up into heaven. Or she doesn't die, and she just goes physically up into heaven right away. The point of this is that if Mary is so special and so pure, she shouldn't have to suffer death like regular humans do. So she gets a special kind of ascension up into heaven, and that's part of Catholic doctrine. Another idea that connecting to this point that there's beliefs among Christians that they don't realize are not biblical. This is much more a Catholic doctrine or Coptic and Greek Orthodox, but it's an idea about how Mary died, not in the Bible, but very common in these texts, very much a part of the Christian liturgical cycle. But not biblical.
Wow, that's fascinating. I was thinking about, do you have like a knowledge or an idea of like locations on some of these texts? Are there some, like, I know like if it's Coptic, obviously it was in Egypt, but like, is there some certain places where certain texts are more popular than others? For example, I don't know, Antioch, Syria, or Rome has this particular book is like huge in Rome, but nobody over here has it. Is there anything like that?
Thinking again about the early period, people are really interested in where these ideas kind of crop up, and so we with the canonical Gospels, we try to kind of pinpoint them in various places. Mark, maybe Rome. Matthew, maybe Antioch. We don't really know. None of the texts ever say where they're from, right? And so sometimes people think about schools of thought that originate in certain places. So the Thomas literature, for example, tends to get placed in Syria. That's the really good example of that. But again, as I said, it's really hard to pinpoint them. And so when these things spread out, we certainly do see certain places where certain texts are more popular than others. I guess one example we can bring up is Bartholomew. So we have several texts associated with Bartholomew, and he's considered a kind of a patron saint of Armenia. So his Acts texts talk about him journeying to Armenia, and they talk about where his relics are and so on. So certainly very, very popular in Armenia, and that's where most of our traditions are. Then we have some texts. I think Acts of Timothy is connected with Ephesus. And this was something like a 5th century or so text. And really, it's clear that this text was written there. It knows the areas so well and certainly wants to create this connection between Timothy and Ephesus. So we have those kinds of regional things, right? There's an Acts of Titus, which is connected to Crete. And really, we think about those connections because of how well the authors seem to know their places. And the reason that the knowledge of the places are so infused in the text is because the authors are trying to make these connections with particular apostles and therefore validate their particular church. But also, if you can trace where the various places that Titus goes on the island of Crete, it becomes almost a pilgrimage itinerary. So all these places become very important. And so they become ideal places for Christians who want to express their piety to visit, buy some things, some knickknacks that the churches sell, or some texts or icons, etc. So it becomes an industry, really. So the text becomes connected with places, with festivals, with artifacts, and so on. These things all really connect to one another quite well.
That's fascinating. Now I want to talk about John the Baptist a little bit. There's some questions about which apocryphal texts tell us about the life of John the Baptist that the 4 main Gospels don't.
This question might arise somewhat from the fact that in the Gospel of Luke we have a birth story of John the Baptist, and we have this connection, of course, with Jesus and John as adults. Jesus seems to be interested in the John the Baptist preaching. He becomes part of the group and then goes off on his own. And we also find out in, I think it's the book of Acts, that the Baptist group continues even after Jesus split from and John the Baptist's death. So there's kind of a mystery around what exactly is the origins of John the Baptist and his group and what happened to them. Most of our information about the life of John the Baptist, so expansions on this, tend to be late. So I'll talk about them in a second, but the earliest material, probably earliest text of all, is, again, the Gospel of James. And after going through Mary's birth, conception, upbringing, and Jesus' birth, we get this one story of John the Baptist. And it really answers the question of how did John the Baptist get saved from the massacre of the innocents in Bethlehem? He may not have really been in Bethlehem, but still this idea that John the Baptist was a child too, and how come he didn't die? So we have the story where the soldiers of Herod come looking for John the Baptist, and his mother escapes, his mother Elizabeth, with him into the desert. And there's a great big mountain, and she calls upon God to help her, and the mountain opens, and she goes inside, and it closes, and she's saved. So that's a very early text. This gets expanded in later texts. So most of our later John the Baptist texts are expansions of what we find in the Gospels and the expansion of that story, which shows you in a sense how important that text was, because it becomes the raw material for later on, right? It's almost on the same level as the canonical Gospels as a source for John the Baptist. So the 3rd volume of the More New Testament Apocrypha series has a few John the Baptist texts in it that I worked on. So these are Greek, Byzantine, probably fairly late. But basically they take that story from the Gospel of James and expand on it quite a bit. So we learn, well, often these texts answer questions, right? So like the slaughter of the innocents thing. So how did John the Baptist and Elizabeth survive in the mountain? Well, this text tells us that an angel fed them. And then what happened after that? Well, as soon as Herod the Great died and he wasn't after John anymore, an angel comes along and takes them back home. And then John grows up, and then we get the story of his death at the hands of Herod Antipas, and then some other things as well. And we also learn that what happened to John the Baptist's body. The Gospels tell us he was beheaded. So what happened? Well, this text tells us that angels brought it and to the Jerusalem temple and placed it with Zacharias, his father, who also is buried in the temple. There are other traditions about where John is buried. That's just one of them. Everyone seems to want to have John in their particular location. But yeah, it's answering kinds of these questions. What happened to John's body? What happened to How did he get fed in the mountain? And the text ends with what happened to the Herods, because every villain has to get his comeuppance, right? So we learn about the death of Herod Antipas, his wife and his daughter all meet grisly ends. The historical figures we know about from Josephus, and they lived fine. They went on to live out their lives in a way that most royal family people do. Even if they're in exile, they're still wealthy and protected. So Christian imagination didn't like that. They didn't like it that they had a nice cushy end. So they create these stories in which they die gruesome deaths. So that's one of the things that they want to do. And the last one, I think I'll mention one other because I don't want to belabor the point. But Mandaean literature. So the Mandaeans are a Gnostic group from Iran. They have some connections with Manichaeism. But it's interesting in their text that they really elevate John the Baptist even higher than Jesus. He's portrayed as an envoy of light. So if they see the world as the cosmos as being forces of darkness and forces of light. So John the Baptist is this envoy of light who comes along, and he interacts with Jesus, and they're actually adversaries. And Jesus is accused in the text of being a lying prophet and magician, and he gets expelled. And so the Mandaeans, they don't trace themselves to Jesus, they trace themselves to John the Baptist. And so they have several texts which talk about him and various activities in his life and messages that he passed along to this group.
Wow. Because when you hear about that, you're like, it really makes you wonder, like, how does this tradition come about that is competing with the Christian tradition where John gets put higher? You also have there's another tradition where Simon Magus is the highest, and he's the Simonians have him as the one to look up to. And like, again, Jesus is like, yeah, he's there, but like, he's not as good as Simon Magus. I don't know how they would portray that. And his wife Helena, they thought that she was Athena incarnate, and Hippolytus relates this in the refutation stories. But I wonder, it just makes you wonder about these early traditions and how diverse they were, you know?
Yeah. Well, even just look at the book of Acts, canonical book of Acts. Here we have Philip goes to Samaria. He meets Simon Magus there. Philip does some miracles, and Simon says, offers to buy the power that Philip has. So we know Simon Magus is an actual historical figure. Acts talks about him. And you think of that little story as interactions between these figures in antiquity who amass followings around themselves. Acts portrays it so that Philip is the winner in this kind of dispute, and Simon Magus is humbled. You can just imagine that the groups around people like Simon would have their own traditions, their own texts, in which their chosen figure is the winner, right? So I'd like to think of when we see conflicts in text, which something I'm quite interested in is conflicts, that they are some kind of a microcosm of some historical reality. The actual event may not have happened. Philip and Simon Magus may not have had this conflict or contest of sorts. We get similar things in the Acts of Peter, between Peter and Simon Magus. They may not have happened, but the groups that come after may have been in competition with one another. So Christians versus the Simonians are reflected in the text with Peter or Philip and Simon Magus. In the Christian texts, the Christians always win. We don't have the texts of the Simonians, but we have traditions about them. We hear about them. There may have been texts at some point. We don't know. But certainly in their traditions, their leader would be the one who would come out on top. And the Mandaeans, similar. They may have a historical connection to John the Baptist. It's possible. And if so, these texts pass on some of that over time. They get changed and developed and so on. But there may be some historical kernel there of this group somehow beginning in a John the Baptist group that competed with Christian groups, and so the text reflects those competitions.
Yeah, and it also, to me, when I'm thinking about these conflicting traditions, it sort of makes me think it's more likely that these people are historically, like, I guess, real, like, but not that people, because people do doubt these people's existence. You
Sure.
do have a lot of, especially on the internet. But like if you think about it, if this was all just made up, why would there be traditions that conflict with another tradition if it's coming out of, like, you would think if this was all just made up, there'd just be one Christianity, and then you'd have, like, some diversity happening from that source, but not like, oh, our guy's better than your guy.
Yeah.
It's more likely that if there was people thinking one guy's higher than another guy, that those people probably existed. I think that's probably a good indicator.
I think so. It's not beyond possibility that someone could be invented, and people keep developing the traditions about this invention, not realizing that they were invented. That's possible. But I think what we end up getting in the various texts, both canonical and non-canonical, are these little elements of incidental information, like connections to figures like Simon and John the Baptist. So Mark, for example, will mention Simon of Cyrene who carried Jesus' cross, and will mention that his sons are still with us. So these little bits of historical information, right, that the authors know, and I think that can't all be made up. It's just
that's a good point. It's random information that you don't just say. I totally agree with what you're saying, and I think people should. I challenge people who are on the farther skeptic side, that are like, none of this is I challenge you to look at those things. Some of these things just don't make sense unless there's something historically there. Well, that brings me to the next question, because you do have these traditions that arise, and they were trying to portray a message through these characters. For example, the Gospel of Judas. What is the Gospel of Judas trying to? What's the purpose of this text? Because Judas is like, most people think Judas is like the evil one who betrayed Jesus, but this Gospel of Judas story sort of flips it on its head and changes it up a little bit and gives us a different portrayal. What is the purpose of this text?
Right. And it's good to ask about purpose, right? You segue that from history. Sometimes people think, well, texts just tell history. They're just telling a story. But no, all texts have a reason, right? Have a purpose. People select what's in them for a particular reason, right? So the Gospel of Judas, we know it existed by around 180 when Irenaeus of Lyon mentions it. But no one had seen the Gospel of Judas. We have no trace of it from antiquity until, I think it was around 2004, maybe 2007, something like that, when a copy of it was finally released to the world. And the scholars who were involved in creating the critical edition and translation of that text, they had a particular way of understanding it. And they saw Judas in the text as a hero, not a villain. And this goes back in part to Irenaeus, because Irenaeus says that the people who valued this text thought of Judas that way. But scholars who came after the initial translation team said, no, I don't think that's what it says at all. And I'll give you one example from the text. This is the one I tend to use with my students. There's a section of it in which Jesus is criticizing the apostles. So the 11, right? Everyone but Judas. And he says terrible things about them. At one point, these apostles have a dream in which they see some priests, and they're doing awful things, sacrificing their children, having sex with men, not awful in their estimation, various acts of murder. And Jesus says, well, that's you guys. So the apostles are portrayed very, very negatively. And think of that, again, as a microcosm of groups in the church. So this would be your mainstream Orthodox Christianity as reflected in the 12 apostles, or the 11, I should say. So certainly this text is setting itself up against mainstream Christianity of some sort. And Judas is certainly one outside that number because he's a betrayer. So he's kind of set apart as somewhat special. So Jesus now has this discussion with Judas. And at one point he says, see the apostles over there. They are terrible. You will surpass them. Now, the original translation of it made it sound like you are better than them. You surpass them. But the subsequent translators said, no, that's not what it means at all. You will surpass them in your villainy. You are going to be worse than them. So we have two different approaches to the text. Is Judas better than the nasty apostles, or is he worse than the nasty apostles? And the worse then seems to be carrying the day. But the rest of the text goes on, and Jesus talks to Judas about certain cosmological and cosmogonical details about how the universe was created. It's a fully Gnostic kind of description of the world. And the whole point of the text then is that orthodoxy is worshiping the wrong God. It's worshiping the demiurge, this creator of this lower realm, whereas Jesus comes from the realm of the higher God. And so he's telling Judas this. But in the end of the text, Judas still betrays him, and Judas is still the villain.
It's such a fascinating story, because on one hand you have Jesus telling him, here you have the secret knowledge, you're going to be called the 13th, which is a really, you don't hear like the 13th. Isn't he one of the 12? Wait, is there another one? Like basically saying you're going to be an outsider.
Yeah.
And so, but like you said, I didn't realize that until you just mentioned that there's two different interpretations. One of them saying you'll be better, another one saying you'll surpass them in your villainy. Wow, it just makes you wonder, like, these early Christians have different views on certain things, and it's fascinating. It really is.
Well, that's scholars having different views on different things too, right? It's about trying to understand a text which is fragmentary.
Sure.
It's a Coptic translation from Greek, so the Coptic translators probably messed some things up. So these things can be very difficult. Another thing that they do in there is Judas is described in the text as a demon. The original translators kind of do a bunch of athletics or acrobatics, whatever you want to say, try to show how demon is not a bad thing. It just means spirit. It's something rather innocuous. But this is a Christian text. A Christian text uses the word demon. It's probably a negative thing. And so again, the new translators are saying, no, Judas is bad. Now, it's not all that strange for Gnostic texts to flip things on their heads, right? So it's not surprising that Judas could become heroic, because in the Gnostic creation story, the snake is the hero, right? And the God is the villain. So it's not beyond possibility, but it just doesn't seem to be going on in that text.
There's a group called the Cainites. I don't know if you're familiar with them. Everything's the opposite for these guys. The Cain's the hero. Judas is the hero. The serpent's the hero. Anything that's just the opposite of whatever the text says. Like, these were some real rebels, some real early Christian rebels at the time. But yeah, it also shows you how a mistranslation can even create another tradition. Maybe, is that possible, you think?
I guess so. And you never know what people are going to do to develop that tradition, right? Even in a modern period where people, with the sensation that this caused when it was when the translation and edition were published. So you saw people talking about it on the media, and so the media is saying, scholars claim that Judas was a hero, et cetera, et cetera. Well, no. At best, those scholars said this text portrays Judas that way. We don't really know the history, right?
Sure.
But it's because of discussion of it in popular arenas like the television media, it becomes kind of stuck in people's heads. So people will now always think that Judas was seen as a hero in the Gospel of Judas, because the scholarship that came after is not as widely known. And so you could certainly see people developing that tradition in certain ways, not necessarily creating new texts, but certainly in their discussions of Judas, and they would expand it to include the misreadings of the Gospel of Judas that become fairly entrenched.
And I think if you're one of those predetermined, like the Calvinist types, you kind of have to think that Judas was chosen in some higher purpose, or else it's like, well, then why is this why did it play out that way? Because you
Right.
think everything's predetermined. So I mean, I know Augustine wrote a lot about this this in between everything having predetermination but also having free will.
Hmm.
And I think Judas is the perfect study for this type of thing. Like, is he wrong or is he chosen? Like, which one is it?
Hmm. Yeah, and the story had to play out this way. This is the way God planned it, right? So Judas never really had a choice in some ways. I guess it's worked out by the theologians, as you say, about balancing predestination and free will. I tend to like the modern takes on Judas, where he's seen as less villainous and shades of gray we like in modern consciousness, right? So it's a great scene in the Last Temptation of Christ where Jesus is talking to Judas, and Jesus tells Judas, "You have to betray me." And Jesus is like, "I can't do that." He says, "Why would you ask me to do that?" And he says, That's why God gave me the easy job. So Jesus's job to die on a cross is easy. Betraying one's friend is the hard one. And Judas is doing it reluctantly. He's being told to do it by Jesus. It's the role he has to play. So those takes on Judas, I think, are really interesting and really says something about our modern world, where I think we try to find the intention behind what people do, and we understand that things can be very complicated. So a modern Judas is a much more conflicted character than the one we find in the Bible.
There's also this interpretation which might lead to some anti-Semitism as well, because Judas, the name Judas, is like Judah and
Yeah.
Hebrew, and like he's the one betraying Jesus. And it's like, you also had Jesus cursing fig trees, and the fig tree represents Israel, and so you wonder if a lot of this stuff sort of plays into this. Those are the bad. They're the ones who deny the Messiah, and what comes from that, makes you wonder.
Yeah. And again, this is like I was mentioning about looking at these texts and trying to see what reflects microcosms or groups in the text, right? Was Judas a historical figure, or does he represent the choice between the choice for the people around him, Jews of Judea, of accepting or not accepting Jesus? Now, the name Judas is a very common name for the time. Judas. Jesus had a brother named Judas, which is what we call him, Jude. So it's certainly possible. Paul talks about how that Jesus was handed over. Usually it's translated as betrayed. So we know that there was a tradition around Paul's time of something like that happening, but he never names Judas. So by the time you get to the Gospel of Mark, has this now spun out into this, again, a microcosm of Jewish reception to Jesus as Judas? It's certainly possible. And when we see Judas represented in medieval art, he's often portrayed in certain ways that reflect the Jewish people. So he certainly becomes associated with Jewish rejection of Jesus in iconography and art.
That's such a good point too, because that's one of the parts of Paul's letters that really indicate something actually happening historically.
Yeah.
As Jesus being handed over, when he talks about the night he was handed over, he's talking about an event there.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's pretty clear something did happen, but like you said, there's no mention of Judas. There's no, and then it's like that historical event become something like the Judas tradition. Interesting. Go ahead.
Have you been reading Richard Carrier lately, by the way?
I'm familiar with Richard Carrier. I used to think, before I started really talking to a lot of academics, I was convinced by him because I left the church, and I became a mythicist, and I was like, yeah, this is a PhD. He's an
Mhm.
expert, so he has to be right. And then the more I started talking to other academics, I started to say, well, there's some problems here, especially with the whole pre-existing angelic thing, where
Yeah.
we just don't have any evidence of that. And so, yeah, but I'm curious why you thought that, because I've done videos actually refuting Carrier.
Okay.
I'm
I'll
like,
have to check them out.
yeah, I'll send you the link. I didn't know if you saw it or not, but yeah, I don't think I think it's fringe now. I do.
Yeah.
I just I mean, I think the Q thing makes a lot of sense. So obviously, someone said something. These sayings are coming from somewhere. I also think like we just mentioned that part in Paul where the night he was handed over. What night is that? Who is he talking about? Who handed over? So something happened.
Yeah.
Somebody got crucified, and then that little kernel of historical truth gets, legendized. Um, but yeah, Carrier on the internet, he has a lot of people who think he's very convincing to a lot of people, and that's kind of my channel is sort of in that trench warfare. But I'm a historian. I think he's existed, obviously. Yeah, that's where I'm at. But
Yeah. And I'm relatively skeptical about a lot of information in the Gospels. I just think
yeah,
this is so much, invention. But I don't go so far as to think that Jesus never existed. Um, I I actually assigned Carrier's Jesus from Outer Space book to my class a couple of years ago, as an example of Jesus scholarship. They had a range of texts books they could read. So Carrier was one, and Reza Aslan was another one, and then a few others. I kind of regretted it. It's interesting, but he's got such a chip on his shoulder.
that's what it is. It's
Yeah.
This is the thing about. I'll just give you a couple of prime examples. So when he's talking about the other dying and rising gods,
Mhm.
what he'll do is, for example, he said that Osiris was dead for 3 days and 3 nights, and resurrects on Easter. And like, whoa, that sounds like. And then he'll say like Inanna was crucified. Okay, whoa, where are you getting this from? But then when you actually look at the text that he's referencing, he's playing with the language. Inanna doesn't get crucified. Inanna gets put on a. She does get hung on a wood with a nail, which is like, okay, you can let's just say it that way. Why do you have to change the language to make it sound Christian? He did the same thing with Osiris. Osiris wasn't dead for 3 days and 3 nights. It was dead. He was dead for 4 months actually, because he gets killed in the winter or fall time. He does resurrect. He does come back up in the springtime. There was a celebration of his resurrection for springtime, but it's only because Isis mourns for 4 days.
Mhm.
So he finds that passage, Isis mourned for 4 days, and then he says 3 days and 3 nights. So it's like he's taking things, and then the way he portrays it to the audience, it's like he's like stretching it a little bit.
Yeah.
That when I started finding that stuff out, I was like, okay, that's not cool. But the big thing for me where I say, okay, I'm out of this. I'm no longer convinced by this. It's not about that. It's not that mythicists are questioning the evidence of Jesus. Like, for example, he didn't write anything down. Yeah, good point. He didn't write anything down. All right, where's the contemporary evidence? Where's the physical evidence at? Okay, there really isn't any. Sure, that's all fine. But that's not what mythicists are saying. What mythicists are saying is there was a Jesus tradition that predates Paul, and then these Jews worshipped an angel named Jesus who didn't exist, and then he was euhemerized.
Yeah.
If that's a big claim, and if that's true, we would have evidence for that.
Mhm.
You can't just theorize that and then just say it. I'm right. Like, you need to show why that's the case. And we don't have any traditions of any Jews we even have angelology. There's tons of angel names. As far as I'm concerned, Jesus is not one of them.
Mhm.
Even if you did find that, even if you found like a list of angels from first century BCE somewhere, and there was like a Jesus on there, it still wouldn't be that big of a deal because it's just a name. But you don't even have that. So as far as I'm concerned, we're working with nothing. We're just like, it's like you're pushing. It's almost like you have a hypothesis, and instead of letting the data speak for itself, you're plugging everything in to make it fit.
Mhm.
So it's like Carrier could be right, but like it's the way he argues it's not like we're putting our heads together and trying to figure out if it's true. It's that he's arguing to make it sound true. That
Right.
makes sense. So that's my whole beef with Carrier. But anyway, I've had some videos on that, but yeah, no, I think I like you mentioned just before I said that is obviously this is a lot of this stuff is mythologized. A lot of the gospels are mythology. I just think it's more likely that it's based off historic, like there was a guy.
Mhm.
If that makes sense. Any thoughts on that?
Yes. I think that I don't recall all the arguments he's making in the book now. I'm trying to block them out. But one, I think, good one is what he does with James. So Paul talks about James and being the brother of Jesus. And Carey goes, really out of his way to show that he doesn't really mean real brother. So it's about, and that's what he tends to do, and particularly with Paul, is these little bits of information. He ignores the common sense interpretation and does these weird acrobatics to make it so it's something cosmic and weird.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
and that's the thing. It's like, okay, if you're going to say this is all cosmic, all right, where's the evidence for that?
Yeah.
Where's the tradition at? And like, he'll say, oh, well, they didn't preserve those texts.
Yeah, because it's been suppressed.
Yeah, but we have that all the heresies and the heresiologists writing about Docetism and all the Gnostic groups. What would be the reason to just single this one thing out
Mhm.
compared to all these other heresies? There is no reason.
Yeah.
And like you said, there's like when Paul talks about Jesus being born of a woman under the law, according to the law,
Yeah.
by the seed of David. Those are specific. Those are terminology. We see those in the Dead Sea Scrolls. People born according to the law. That it only means one thing. You don't see that ever. Why would that be a? Why would that be a celestial thing? What's the reason to say that? Well, because you're trying to make it fit into this mythicist thing. That's what it looks like to me. So that's why I'm not convinced. I used to be, and that's why a big topic on my channel has been mythicism. That's why I'm always asking questions about historicity. I don't know if you picked up on that, but that's because I used to think that was the case, and I'm still fascinated by the topic.
Mhm.
I think it's a fascinating topic. Is this real? Is this true? How much of it is real? How much of it is historical? I think it's a fascinating topic.
Mhm. Yeah, and I agree. It's as with most things in life. Things that go on a spectrum. You believe everything, or you believe nothing, and truth is somewhere usually in between. I think I would be more open to Carrier's positions if he didn't present them the way he does, and the way and how he talks about other scholars and their views.
That's what everybody says about him.
He's not a pleasant fella.
If he presented his arguments a little bit more honestly, like instead of being like, yeah, Cyrus was dead for 3 days and 3 nights. If he actually said, oh, since Isis mourned for 4 nights, maybe the Christians are looking at that possibility. Like if he kept it in that language, I think people would respect it a little more, rather than saying, no, this is the case, and everyone's just dumb because they don't see it. And that's why nobody wants to hear it anymore, because the way you're arguing is just like comes off that way. So I agree with you on that. I think he would have been fine if he just would have, but been a little more professional about it. But whatever.
Yeah, I think so.
So the next question is about the Gospel of Mary.
Okay.
And do you think the Gospel of Mary suggests that early Christianity was divided?
Well, I think every every apocryphal text and even some canonical texts tell us that Christianity was divided, right? They're all reflections of one group or another. 4 canonical gospels, these are 4 different groups that, as different as they were close enough that they could form something united, and therefore we get the New Testament as a reflection of bringing groups together, right? Some groups did not get brought together, did not get invited to the party. So the Gospel of Mary, it certainly reflects something a bit unorthodox. And I think the very end of the text, where we have this discussion between Mary and Peter, shows that we are dealing with a group that sees itself as distinct from orthodoxy as represented by Peter, who tends to be Roman Orthodox Christianity in the text. So again, characters as microcosms. So Mary has this teaching that she says she got from Jesus. She presents it to the apostles. Peter says, there's no way that this is true. And then Levi comes to Mary's defense, and then everyone kind of settles down. But what is it that divides this group from other groups? That would be in the teaching. And the teaching, as Mary has a vision of Jesus, and he tells her about how the soul ascends from earth up into the heavens. And we see these ascents in Greek literature at the time, but also in Gnostic texts. And Gnostic texts are, really a form of Christianity that brings in a lot of Greek ideas. And the idea is that after death, for the Gnostics at least, your soul goes up to the highest heaven because you have the saving knowledge, and so you get to transcend the earth and go up to where you should be. And along the way, you encounter certain demonic figures, gatekeepers, and you have to tell them secret, special words in order to get past them. And we have lots of examples of these things, but Mary is one of them. Unfortunately, the middle section of the Gospel of Mary is lost, so we don't have the entire text, but certainly we have some of it, which gives a sense of the teaching which would not be considered acceptable to people who would value Peter as the head of their group. So Mary's group, big into Gnostic ascent, maybe some other things that have dropped out of the text. Maybe also there's the sense that this group values women more than mainstream Christianity does, since Mary gets such a vital role here. I think we have to be careful to jump too quickly to this notion that Gnostic groups were like proto-feminists, but because a character is portrayed a certain way doesn't mean it reflects their actual day-to-day beliefs. But we do have other evidence that certain groups valued women more than mainstream patriarchal Christianity did. So it's not beyond possibility. So yeah, these texts like the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, they seem to grab a hold of a character who's just outside the 12 and make them the spokesperson for their group. So they're certainly differentiating themselves from the mainstream and presenting ideas that presumably the mainstream would not find or have not found palatable, but they become the avenue to get these ideas across. So this is what the church is telling you, the mainstream church, or the most powerful group in our community, but here's another idea that comes from somewhere else in the tradition, and then that's what they present in our text.
Do you think, because in this text you have Peter as this opposing voice to Mary, do you think that if Peter represents the church as like the Church of Rome, maybe, do you think there's something happening there in the text that's sort of they're putting that versus the Orthodox or whatever, the Church of Rome versus Mary, who is the secret knowledge? Is that you think that's what's happening in this text?
Yeah, and we see also same thing also at the end of the Gospel of Thomas, where it's again Peter and Mary in opposition. Well, Mary is not speaking, but Jesus is representing her. Peter's saying women aren't deserving of life, meaning immortality, and Jesus says, "I will make her male," which is some kind of spiritual mumbo jumbo. But the point is that women are allowed in. And so here we have Gospel of Mary, again, an issue of women being allowed in or being allowed to have a voice. And then we have another text a little bit later on called Epistis Sophia, where again we have Mary being represented. She's one of the most vocal characters in our text, and again Peter is vying with her, arguing with her about women's roles, women's place. So, if we see that in one text, it's a curiosity. We see it in three. What's going on there? So it certainly seems to be that we do have this microcosm of a conflict. And it's not all the time that Peter represents a villainous kind of a character in our texts. We have texts written in his name as well. A couple of texts called the Apocalypse of Peter or a Gospel of Peter. So certainly he's not always a villain. He's not always presented as the person who opposes us in the text. But certain groups seem to like to use him in that way to represent a powerful form of Christianity, but not necessarily the correct form.
Fascinating. This is the text that I think everybody should check out, is that Gospel of Mary. It's a really fascinating text. And that, my favorite, I'm just, for the sake of, to give people a glimpse, and my favorite part of that text, and it's such a fascinating passage, is when Jesus is telling Mary not to make laws. I think he says something along the lines of, don't write laws like the lawless ones do. And I'm like, and this is the Jesus that's being portrayed in this text is just such a fascinating character. I really like this text because the way Jesus is portrayed is this super sage with this, and the words he's saying, like, it's really well done. It's really, it's like I just think people need to see that side of Jesus more than than everyone's used to. It's a different side.
Yeah. I wish we had the complete text. It'd be just to see the entire thing. And this is a text that we talked earlier about what was popular and what was not popular in antiquity. Before we found a copy of the Gospel of Mary, we had no idea that it even existed. So it probably wasn't very popular in antiquity. We have, I think, 2 copies of it, maybe 3. None of them complete, but it's completely off everyone's radar. None of the heresiologists mention it. It doesn't come up in lists of texts not to read. It's just barely known at all. So it's a wonder that it survived.
Yeah,
we have a few other texts like that, but we never knew that they existed in antiquity until we found copies of them.
Yeah, that's another thing. So with the text that we have is missing a big chunk. Is it because we only have one manuscript of it? Is that what's going on? Or the copies of it are also the same? Is that what happened?
No, we have one not full. We have one longer Coptic manuscript with some missing pages. So literally some pages have fallen out. That's why we don't have it. And then the 1 or 2 others, sorry, I don't remember if there's 1 or 2, are just papyrus fragments. So just little bits. So yes, we did have full copies of these, at least 3, but they've all suffered damage in some way.
Wow. And does anyone ever mention this text throughout until we find it, or no?
No one.
Wow.
Yeah.
It just pops up out of nowhere. What was this, like the 1900s when they found it?
Something like that. I don't think it was published until, I think, it might not have been published until after the Nag Hammadi Library was found. The wars kind of got in the way a little bit of publishing some things, but it's found in a manuscript. I think it's the Bruce Codex that is not part of the Nag Hammadi find, but it's a manuscript from Egypt in Coptic, and it tends to get brought into the discussions of Nag Hammadi library material because it's so similar in thought. So sometimes people get confused thinking it is from the Nag Hammadi library, but it's not. Right. But it is a single book collection of Gnostic texts. Gospel of Mary is one of them. Apocrypha of John is another one. So it certainly has overlaps with Nag Hammadi material.
Wow, that's fascinating. The last thing I want to ask you about, and a lot of people that watch me are big fans of Dennis MacDonald's work.
Yeah,
and he does a lot of work on the mimesis, the Greco-Roman epics. In your research, in your line of work, have you come across any examples of these apocryphal texts having connections or something drawing from Greco-Roman instead of just the Hebrew side that we always know, that we all know about?
For sure. Like these are writers writing in Greek, so they're educated in Greek. They know at least some of their Greek classics, right? We have evidence of on papyrus and potsherds and stuff like that of school exercises where people would be copying out pieces of Homer. So people were educated on this. So we should expect to see references here and there or allusions to Greek classics texts. And yeah, Dennis MacDonald is classic for doing this. I think where he got his start with this was with the Acts of Andrew.
Yeah.
And so the Acts of Andrew is, again, one of these individual apocryphal acts. And there's another text somewhat related to it called the Acts of Andrew and Matthias, in which Andrew rescues Matthias from the hands of these cannibals in a place called Myrmidon, or Myrmidonia, I should say. And Dennis thinks the Acts of Andrew and Matthias was the lost beginning to the Acts of Andrew. So he reads them all together as one long text. And he's thinking, where does this idea of the Myrmidonians come from? And it comes from Homer, this land of cannibals. And so he sees the Acts of Andrew and Matthias all together with it as kind of a Christianization of Homer. And he has this long list of parallels between not only in the Odyssey and the Iliad, but some other Greek classics as well. And I think that there's really something to that with that particular text. I don't necessarily agree that the two texts were originally joined, but I do think it's quite reasonable to think that there could be parallels with Greek classics in there to make Andrew a Christian Odysseus, though without all the themes that the Christians may not be as attracted to. I tend, though, to think that Dennis makes too much out of small things. Like he'll see a word here and say, "Oh, this is evoking this," and then it makes a lot out of isolated words, which I think goes too far often. But then the basic notion that writers of both canonical and non-canonical texts who write in Greek, who are writing primarily to Greek audiences, would know their Homer, would know their and some other classical texts. Another example you can bring in is the Apocalypse of Peter. Apocalypse of Peter is Jesus has come back from the dead, and he takes Peter on a tour of the underworld. And this is one of many tour of hell apocalypses, as we call them, tour of hell apocalypses. Paul is an Apocalypse of Paul, which is very similar. Apocalypse of Mary, very similar. These tours of the underworld. And the underworld, the topography of the underworld is essentially the way the Greeks looked at it. You get rivers of fire. We sometimes get Charon, the guy who takes people across one of the rivers on his boat. We get the terminology, Hades, Tartarus, all these other things. This is really drawn from Greek mythology, not Jewish depictions of the underworld, though. We don't really have any developed Jewish depictions of the underworld, but like we do in Greek literature. So certainly that's an adaptation of those ideas for a Christian audience. So I like Dennis very much. I like some of what he does, but I tend to see that sometimes he's like I said, making too much sometimes out of isolated words rather than convincing parallels.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even in Revelation, which is not apocryphal, it's in the canon, you have the passage where Hades and death and the sea give up their dead.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, that sounds like something out of the Odyssey or something, like Hades and death. And it turns out, I didn't even realize this till recently, in the Orphic hymns, those are all three different deities that are prayed to. Thassalah is the sea. You actually do it. There's a hymn to Thassalah. There's a hymn to death, Thanatos, and there's a hymn to Hades. And so you're like, are these characters that are in the Revelation? I've asked so many academics this question, and I get so many different. It's like it's all over the place. It's kind of a mysterious passage. Do you have any thoughts on that passage or no?
Not on that particular passage because I haven't really thought about it, but just one other thing to think about because we're bringing in the canon here. Dennis did a really good study of the Gospel of Mark as a transformation of the Odyssey, and I used to assign it in my classes years ago because I thought it was really fun. And coming back to this issue of history, how much of Mark's Gospel, the first Gospel that we know of that existed, is history, and how much is it? Well, this is how you tell stories of heroic figures, and the paradigm of heroic figures is Odysseus and the storms at sea, right? In the Gospel of Mark, he makes something out of the fact that the Zebedee brothers, John and James, are called the sons of thunder, and that evokes something from the Odyssey as well. So I really enjoyed that. I'm not sure how convinced I was by it, but again, why wouldn't a Greek writing author know the Odyssey, and why wouldn't that influence his text?
Yeah, have you the one that? So I agree with you on McDonald. I think he's convincing in some areas and others not. I totally think you're out. I think you're right about that. The one that I'm really convinced about that he told me that I'll never. I just see it. Like I just see what he sees. Is the one about the anointing of Jesus' feet? Have you heard this one yet?
I don't think so. Go on.
I'll tell you about it. It's really fascinating. So in the Gospel of Mark, I think it's chapter 14, beginning of chapter 14, when Jesus' feet are being anointed or rubbed and oil is being put on it, and she's drying it with her hair, and all the other disciples are getting pissed off and like, come on, you could have sold that to the poor. And he says, no, 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 no. What she did today will be told far and wide. Right? Something like that. Something like
We're good.
similar to that. Well, okay. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus returns to his house, and he doesn't know, they don't know who he is. Oh, but I have to go back. Paul, I have to rewind for a second. Jesus is the woman recognizes that he's the Messiah. So there's a recognition happening. She recognizes he's the Messiah. Well, okay, so let's go back to Odyssey. Odysseus's feet are being rubbed by Eurycleia. She doesn't know nobody knows it's Odysseus yet. He comes back, he's got his cloak over his head, and she's rubbing his feet. And then she recognizes her master. And okay, you're like, all right, what's so big the deal about that? Well, her name is Eurycleia. The name Eurycleia means fame far and wide. What Jesus told the woman that's rubbing her feet, what she did today will be told far and wide. It's almost as if it's a pun on the name Eurycleia. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's certainly a better example than the ones I think would be dodgy. That sounds really interesting. I don't remember that from back when I was looking at his Mark book, but it's probably in there. But yeah, it sounds really interesting.
Yeah, but like these are obviously not. It's theories. It's just who knows. Like it could be there. It could be. There's also the possibility that it's not done on purpose. Like, okay, I'll give you like today when people write music or films or whatever, put out a new movie, and they could be writing stuff into the film or into the song that could be influences from places and not even realizing it. It just kind of shows up. There's that possibility as well.
Yeah,
it's not
to think people would not be influenced by their culture is just bonkers. Like people have right? It seeps into everything, whether intentional or not intentional, or whether it's just a way to tell a story or to make a really impactful point. It can range, right? What he's doing there might simply just be a clever evocation to those who would recognize it, rather than a great theological statement, right? So the value of these parallels can range for sure.
Well, I really enjoyed this. I hope you did as well. Anything else you want to? Any projects coming out? I know you got the 3rd edition of these apocryphal texts. I had the link in the description for that.
Great.
Anything else you want to say before we close out?
Well, it would be nice if people bought that book. And there is a possibility of additional volumes, but I'm really tired, and so it'll be a while.
That's a lot. You did a lot of work, and I really appreciate it, because this is
Yeah.
a lot. Everything's in one place for everybody, by the way. But just in case anyone's wondering, the links are in the description for the apocryphal text. There's 3 editions, tons of books that you might have never even heard of that Professor Burke has put together for us, which I'm very grateful for.
Yeah, and of course I'm the editor of it. I'm not the writer, but some of the material in there is mine, and certainly the editorial job is not nothing. It's a lot of work.
Wow.
And they're intended to be somewhat affordable. They're around $100 each, so they're not. I do like the idea of getting scholarly ideas out to as wide an audience as possible, and that's why we do the resource I mentioned earlier, the Nascal's eClavis. So if you don't, if picking up these books is not something you want to do or can afford, that resource gives you an awful lot of information about these texts. There's summaries of the text, there's full bibliographies, manuscript images of iconography, and all this other stuff that's there, free to use. It's just, and again, it's not something that I'm the sole creator of. I'm an editor and a contributor, but this is our organization, the North American Society for the Study of Christian Apocryphal Literature, our way of getting our scholarship, what we work on, out to as wide an audience as possible. Beyond that, I'm working on a volume for the Anchor Bible reference series on Apocrypha. This thing has so far taken me several years, and it will take me several more years. So most of right now I'm trying to put my head down and get that finished, and that'll be a little while away. So things will be quiet from me for a while until that comes out.
Well, thank you again for your time, and you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.